Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Religion and its Contexts, my name is Sean Kazabowski-Housen, and I'm the Events and Media Coordinator for the Center for Religion and its Contexts. And I'd like to welcome you today to our brown bag lunch conversation, a presentation featuring Nicolas Beaulieu, who will talk about Buddhist and Western psychological models of the self and their uses in psychotherapy. And I'm just going to let a few more people in here. And I would like to hand things over to Professor Henry Shiu, who is our Shiu Assistant Professor in Chinese Buddhist Studies.
Hello, everyone. I'm Henry. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Nicolas Beaulieu. I've had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Beaulieu since August 2020, over Zoom, of course. And throughout these months, we had regular meetings and discussion about various different aspects of Buddhism and psychotherapy. Nicolas is Buddhist Education Foundation of Canada Fellow in Buddhism and Psychiatry at the University of Toronto in 2020 to 21. He is originally from Montreal and obtained his medical degree from the University of Montreal in 2014 and completed his psychiatry residency training at McGill University in 2020. Nicolas completed a master's degree in philosophy from King's College, London in 2018 with a thesis on narrativity and the concept of selfhood. His clinical interests include multiple therapeutic modalities, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, and trauma-focused therapy. Nicolas is interested in learning about the intersections between the concept of selfhood and clinical psychotherapy, and how Buddhist perspectives on the matter have the potential to shape clinical interventions and promote well-being. He is also interested in learning about the integration of spirituality in clinical care and providing more holistic care to clients. So Nicolas, I look forward to your presentation.
So thank you very much, Sean and Henry, for the introduction. So today, as Henry and Sean discussed, I'm going to talk about the Western and the Buddhist models of the self, and also the pragmatic applications in psychotherapy. So there's going to be a bit of a more theoretical and a bit more philosophical introduction, but the goal is really to get into the pragmatics and how we might help clients in everyday psychotherapy. So in terms of disclaimers, I want to talk a bit about the psychotherapeutic modalities and allegiances that I have, which might influence also my perspectives and my points of view. So I do have this training in Western psychiatry. I am also training to become an analyst. So I've have a lot of clinical experience in psychodynamic psychotherapy. I do have some experience in cognitive behavioral therapy and in acceptance and commitment therapy. So I'm going to be focusing a bit more on these models, perhaps leaving other models which might have been as well relevant to the presentation, but which we could also talk about in the clinical discussion afterwards. And I'm also not a Buddhist practitioner, so most of the readings and the discussions with Dr. Shiu and with the TCAB Center have influenced my understandings and my points of view, but it's not necessarily from lived experience, so that might limit also my my interpretations. And the goal of the talk, so the talk will be about an hour long, so 40 minutes, around 40 minutes with 20 minutes for questions. And I would also have another 30 minutes afterwards for people who might be interested in other discussion, but I'll try to limit the bulk of the talk to an hour as this is lunchtime. So for the context of this presentation, so I've been, as Dr. Shiu was saying, so I've been in a part of the TCAB Center and been doing this fellowship in Buddhism and Psychiatry. So this talk is part of the work I've been working on over the past few months. And it really comes from a clinical dilemma. So depending on the psychotherapeutic model, independently of the psychotherapeutic model that I've been working with, I've also found that a lot of clients, when we were discussing goals of therapy, were talking about wanting to improve their self-esteem or learn to navigate shame or self-criticism. So this was actually a very, very common clinical team, and I often found that a lot of the models that I've been trained with I found that I was struggling with understanding how to work with these clinical dilemmas. So it really comes from my own struggles with assisting clients working with these problems. So as an outline, I will present different models of the self. So I'm going to present a particular understanding of a Buddhist model of the self. Then afterwards, I'm going to focus on the psychoanalytic model of the self and how self-esteem might be understood or maybe approached from a psychodynamic point of view. I will do the same with cognitive behavioral therapy, then with acceptance and commitment therapy. And then afterwards, moving more to the more pragmatic or more the later clinical orientation of the work, I'm going to introduce a framework for navigating these different struggles about self and self-esteem and how we might translate some of the Western and Buddhist understandings in the everyday clinical room. So then in part one, as I said before, I'm going to summarize the models and then afterwards talk a bit more about the psychotherapeutic actions or interventions in the different models. So then for the Buddhist model of the self, so as you probably all know, it might be, would be a bit difficult given the variety of Buddhist traditions to come up with a Buddhist model of the self. So in the, based on the readings, the clinical discussions that I've had, and also to what I thought might be more easily kind of translatable to the clinical world or more easily applicable, I chose to present a model that might be a bit closer to the Mahayana and Madhyamika traditions than perhaps to other Buddhist models of the self. Which of course are not exclusive to these traditions, but which might have a bit more in common with these traditions. So in terms of the initial Buddhist discussions of the self, they've appeared to have emerged in the context of more Brahmanic views of the soul, where the soul was seen as some sort of essence persisting after death, that with reincarnation, that soul would move on from one existence to the other. And that contrary to these views, the Buddhist views have insisted, well, the actual Buddhist view I was referring to was insisting that there is no such unchanging essence that would constitute the self. So what would be expected typically of a self would be that the self would be unchanging, that it would be a full agent, so fully in control of one's actions, of one's circumstances of existence, and that it wouldn't necessarily create this suffering, and that it seems that there's no such self that could be found, in contrast to perhaps this expected view of the self. So this concept of anatta, so of no self or not self, is quite central in the Buddhist tradition I'm referring to. And in fact, it's often included as the three marks of existence, so which represent these fundamental qualities of existence. So the other two being dukkha and anicca, impermanence. So now I'm going to move on a bit to this understanding of how this self is taught to arise within these traditions. So this is kind of reflects the circle of dependent origination. And it's thought that the perception of the self arises, so you could see the self in the becoming, probably the becoming part of the cycle here, that could be attributed to the self, so that this perception of the self arises from the three defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion, and that our actual craving for something has a role in the emergence of our belief about the self. So simply the act of, for example, liking or disliking something would then participate in creating the self. So for example, when someone is exposed to aches or pains, the experience of not liking this thing creates this I who dislikes these aches and pains. So from this is thought to emerge this sense of false self-other duality, which then contributes to our dissatisfaction and our suffering and keeps the circle going on. So it is thought that acting on these defilements of greed, hatred, delusion, and the craving and attachment might contribute to changing that initial perception of this independent self. So then going back again to this particular Buddhist model of the self, I'm presenting here the five aggregates, so the five skandhas, which many of you might be already familiar with. So the five aggregates are thought to be the forms, so more our physical bodies. So traditionally, what comes up in terms of kind of our very material existence, and then in terms of the other skandhas, there is also the feelings, so the sensations we experience in our body, which also includes pain and pleasure. There's also this skandha of perception. So this is where we have our different sense organs, and each of them have object. And when we put them together, for example, eyes and lights, and our nose and smell, for example, we start to form these perceptions. And then there's the other skandha of formations. So more the mental formations. So these are all of our concepts and all of our thoughts. And then right here in the middle, the number 5, you have consciousness. So this awareness of all of these other skandhas. So it is thought that not necessarily in terms of a philosophical argument in the sense of in a sense that there might be this self that is thought to be unchanging, and since we perhaps might notice from experience or from reflection that these skandhas are not changing in and themselves, then it wouldn't make sense. It is thought that if there was to be a self, they would only be found in these skandhas, and that since these skandhas are unchanging and the self would be unchanging, then there would be no self. So it's not necessarily thought to be that much of a philosophical argument, but more something that one comes to by experience and this realization, notably with meditation, of this impermanence or this unsubstantiality of the self, or what we would attribute to the self. So there's also this metaphor of the chariot that's often discussed, where a man sees a chariot, and the man might be asked, where is this chariot? Where is the essence of this chariot? And then that person might look into all of the different parts of the chariot to see what part could constitute the essence of the self, and might then realize that there's no part of the chariot that would be the essence of the chariot itself, but that the chariot itself might be this aggregate of all of these different parts who are all interdependent in the formation of the chariot, but the chariot itself would have no separate existence. So the same is thought to apply to this self, where we might come to realize this emptiness of the self and this interdependence as well. So then it led me also to reflect in terms of clinical experience of how we might perhaps understand this perception of this feeling of not necessarily being a self that's permanent or unchanging, but this minimal sense of the self of being a person with a story, with a certain continuity, despite not being exactly the same, or also this feeling that I am the same person that I was yesterday, independent of having changes in thoughts, feelings, perception, consciousness, or bodily states. So it got me to thinking, how might a Buddhist view account for this phenomenological sense of self? So here comes this doctrine of two truths, typically thought to be more with in terms of the Mahayana traditions, of this difference between the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. So in that sense, the conventional truth could be seen as not necessarily negating this phenomenological sense of self, that I do have a certain continuity, or that I do have a certain story, or independently of the fact that thoughts, emotions, bodily states are changing. But although it might not reflect the ultimate truth of this emptiness or this truly interdependence of the self, there might be still some place for even this conventional self. So this use of pronouns, this use of I, you, he, she, they, for example, that might still be of use, despite the fact that this that the more ultimate truth would be more about the emptiness of the self and this interdependence. So here, thinking about Buddhist inspired interventions in psychotherapy, there might be this focusing on cultivating this middle path with this attention to the three defilements. So realizing in psychotherapy, for example, where might this craving for a certain self, or or this aversion to a certain sense of self might contribute to distress, and how this belief also, or this delusion aspect of the three defilements about a fixed and changing self, or about this essence of ourselves, might also contribute to more suffering. And there's also different ways of dealing with various hindrances along the way, and difficult thoughts, including thoughts about the self, which might also inform the clinical practice. So notably also, the Buddha was said to have stayed silent when asked about the existence or the non-existence of the self. Perhaps in an effort to avoid the extremes of nihilism, saying that there's absolutely no self, or that it doesn't make sense to understand ourselves in that point of view, and also the extreme of essentialism, so thinking that there's a fixed and unchanging self. And also within the Madhyamaka tradition, there's also some talks about even this limits, the limits of language, or the limits of this analysis even that we're engaging in right now, and conceptual thought, and that even this conceptual thinking about the self might make us a bit more stuck in that framework of the self. So that might also inform possible clinical interventions of seeing how we might move to a bit more of an experiential framework, and a bit less of a verbal or conceptual discussion. So now I'm going to move on to the psychoanalytic models of the self. So as you could imagine, also with Buddhism, there might be also some similar challenges with psychoanalysis, in that psychoanalysis has many various traditions, so that it might be difficult to pinpoint what might be a psychoanalytic model of the self. But here, interestingly, Falkenstrom wrote an article, a Buddhist contribution to the psychoanalytic psychology of the self, and laid out three senses, or three ways in which psychoanalytic models are talked about in the literature, which I'm going to refer to afterwards when talking about these other psychoanalytic models. So the self as experience, the representational self, and the self as system. So in Falkenström's model, the self as experience corresponds more to our subjective inner experience of the self, whether the self is seen as more singular or multiple, but this experience of in a particular moment of realizing what my experiences are, what my bodily sensations are, my thoughts, my emotions are. So really this moment-to-moment observation of our own inner experience. And then there's also this representational self. So this representational self might be more akin to our views of ourselves and also linked to our views of other people, which I'm going to talk a bit more later. But it's thought to be, for example, the sense of I am a good person, or I'm a bad person, I'm a kind person, I'm a caring person, or I'm an angry person. So this might be this sense of a representational self. So this way of seeing ourselves, which might be changing from moment to moment, but thought to be a bit more this symbolic meaning of oneself. And then afterwards, he talks about the self as a system. So in terms of the self as a system, that's a bit more how these different representations of oneself are organized. So they can be organized in a very coherent way. So I might say, for example, okay, I'm a very caring person, but I can be angry at times as well. So be able to form a bit more of a coherent understanding where we might be both partly one representation or partly one other representation, or there might be this sense of self as a system as very divided. So of not be able to reintegrate the fact that we might have good aspects and maybe bad aspects as well. So we're switching from one representation to the other without having a mixture of these different representations. I forgot also to mention, if at any point people want to ask questions more about clarification, you're welcome to interrupt me at any time. If it's more questions about discussion or reflection, we can keep it at the end, but if it's more about clarification, you're welcome to interrupt me. So in psychoanalysis, here I'm presenting Kernberg's view of the self, which is very influential in psychoanalysis, which is why I decided to present this self. So this understanding of the self is closer to the representational view that I was talking about a bit earlier, and also to the other part that I mentioned afterwards, so the self as a system. So these two later senses of the self from Falkenström's article. And so here, this comes from the object relations tradition in psychoanalysis. So this is really based on the embedded in a developmental perspective. So it starts from these very early experiences that a child might have. So just to give an example, we might have a child who feels quite happy and they might be with a parent or a caregiver who's quite supportive, and they're having fun, perhaps going in a park or petting an animal or whatsoever. And so then this might create this internalized sense of, okay, I'm a good person, I'm fun to be with, I'm someone who other people enjoy spending time with. And this sense of a good object, so my caregiver being someone who's available, who's supportive, who's attuned, who's empathic, which might then create a good self and a good object. So oddly enough, in the object relation theory, object means other people as well. So just in terms of clarifying the vocabulary. But then if, for example, the child is very hungry and then crying and then the caregiver is perhaps either not available because they have other concerns, or because they need to take care of another child, or because they're simply at the bathroom, for example, then this might create the sense of a bad self. So I'm someone who's distressed, I'm someone who's angry, I'm someone who's has a lot of strong emotions, and the create the sense of a bad object. So my caregiver is unavailable, not there for me, unresponsive, and perhaps mean, or something else like that. So, which is our representations that are formed at a very young age, or very more kind of black or white. But it is thought that the goal over the course of development, and even in the course of psychotherapy, is to be able to reintegrate these different representations of ourself and of other people. So in the sense of a good self and a bad self, of seeing a bit like I was referring to earlier, of seeing the complexity. Okay, I can be a person who might get angry at times when I don't get what I want, but I'm also someone who's very supportive and understanding of other people. So instead of having these two very opposite views, which are not really reintegrated. So in psychotherapy, when we come to self-esteem, which is a bit the, the point of the talk, of how to navigate these concerns about self-esteem, might be to help the client realize, okay, there might be a sense of perhaps doing quite well and achieving quite well, of being someone very likable, someone very relational. So maybe this very positive sense of self, and perhaps this very negative sense of self, okay, I'm someone who's inferior, someone who's not appreciated by other people, someone who other people will abandon, for example. And the goal in psychotherapy might be to reintegrate these two selves in order to help with the self-esteem, to have a bit less polarized views of having either a bad self-esteem and being inferior, or a very good self-esteem, which often the two coexist in clinical work. Often people not having just low self-esteem, but also having high self-esteem at other moments too. So then in terms of Kohut, who's another influential psychoanalyst who is the leader of self-psychology. So in terms of Kohut, he talked about the fact that we all have these normal narcissistic needs. So for him, the term narcissistic is not used in a pejorative manner. It's really something that we are all taught to have, which can be very minimal, but which include also this need for mirroring. So that might be, for example, when a young child shows a picture of an artwork that they've done to their parents, and their parents might validate them, or might say, might look at it with interest, or might say it really looks nice. Or and then there's also these needs for validation. So recognizing one's own emotions, one's own thoughts, or the sense of oneself as a person. And then there's thought also another of these normal narcissistic needs might be also this need for idealization and gradual de-idealization. So for example, one example that we often see is children who might think that their parents are almost like superheroes, that they have all of the answers, they're very their father is the strongest, their mother is the wisest, or is the nicest, and then gradually be able to de-idealize their parents, of saying, okay, my parents are human too. They have these good qualities about themselves, but also these flaws. And so it's thought to be quite developmentally normative to have this normal need for idealization and realization. And where things can go wrong, and people can come up with a lower self-esteem, or possibly with problems in terms of the self, in terms of cohesion of the self, is where these normal needs are not met. So that maybe children who haven't had people who've been able to look at their artwork and with interest, people who haven't had their feeling being validated, or people who weren't able to idealize their parents, or else whose parents or caregivers were perhaps not able to allow for de-idealization, so wanted to be kept in a very like from a very high held in very high regard. So the idea is that in psychotherapy, the goal is to allow for these normal development of these narcissistic needs to be fulfilled in some ways, akin to what Alexander and other analysts talked about, describe as a corrective emotional experience. So having this experience of being held, of being empathized with, of being valued, of being validated, so which might help with working with issues of self and self-esteem in psychotherapy. So when looking at these different at the psychoanalytic model and contrasting it with Buddhist points of view, it seems that this concept of interdependence is very important, especially in self-psychology, for example, where Kohut talks about self-objects. So mentions that we're not independent from other people. We always need to be with other people, and other people need to be with us, so that there's this constant interdependence between us and other people. So this interdependence might be something central to both models, but there might be also some differences in terms of psychoanalysis. There seems to be a bit more of a developmental view than with Buddhism, for example, talking about what might be the normative steps in terms of people's development in order to reach a certain point also. So there might be this difference in terms of focus. There might also be a bit more of a telescopic point of view in psychoanalysis, so meaning that there might be this view of looking at things how they are right now, but in the context of the rest of one's life, of one's past, so really taking kind of a long view. Whereas in Buddhism, it does appear, from my understanding, that there's a bit more of a punctual view of seeing how are things right now in terms of my bodily sensations, my thoughts, my emotions, and where might be the self or this existence or non-existence of the self in this current experience right now. But at the same time, noting that, and there's been a lot of work written, for example, by Mark Epstein on this, of this ability of psychoanalysis and Buddhism to be well reintegrated, and that in fact it could provide alternative frameworks that might be very useful to combine and to use the strengths of both approaches. So then moving on to the cognitive behavioral therapy model of the self. So in terms of the cognitive behavioral therapy of the self, then again, as a disclaimer, there might be lots of models of the self in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But I chose one from Fennell on low self-esteem, which is quite common and quite standard in how CBT practitioners might approach elements into the self. So so quite similarly to psychoanalysis just above, there's this focus on early experience, so how one's temperament, so how praise or validation or interest. So as you can see, very similar to the self-psychology or the Kohut model of self-esteem as well, being the odd one in family, experiencing loss, rejection, neglect, bereavement, so emotional, physical, sexual abuse. So might contribute to these, what she calls here bottom lines. So bottom line might be, so for some of you who might be more familiar with CBT, might be more akin to core beliefs. So these global or negative self-judgments, so these assessments of one's worth or value as a person. So for example, I'm a bad person, I'm unlovable, I'm helpless, I can't do anything by my own, or I'm not worthy as a person. So come up with these internal senses that we might have, or these bottom line judgment about oneself. But also this formation of these, what she calls escape clauses or standards against which one's worth might be measured. So for example, what might say, okay, I do have this sense that I'm unlovable, but if I do get this relationship and I do get this support from that person, then it means I would be okay. Or I might be unworthy, but if I do get this promotion, for example, at work, or if I do get into this program, let's say, for example, then I might be a bit worthy. But if I do not get in, then I'm not worthy. So of having these perhaps rigid standards against which one's self-esteem are measured. And then here at the bottom, there might be these critical incidents. So these situations in which these standards are either not met. So for example, in the context of if someone was saying like, if I have this promotion, then I'm worthy. If not, I'm unworthy. So if they're not met, this might activate this bottom line of I am really unworthy, or I kind of knew it all along. Which then activates these predictions about what might happen, these maladaptive behaviors. So, which could be either kind of giving up or overcompensating. So, okay, I did not get this promotion, but I'll better work very hard to get the next one because then maybe I'll be worthy. So if I do get it, and then which might end up also perhaps feeding this cycle of confirming this bottom line, this critical thinking, and all of the mood aspects that can come with it. So this idea in psychotherapy might be to work on more these assumptions and these bottom line judgments. So as we can see in this next slide, so this is the information processing model, actually comes from Judith Beck. So of a person having this bottom line judgment or this core belief of I'm incompetent. So there might be, for example, the person might be very able to look at experiences where that confirm this belief that I'm incompetent. So for example, if the person has difficulty with new computer skills or difficulty applying for a loan, then it might confirm the belief I'm incompetent. But there might be some beliefs or some experiences. So at the bottom, so for example, I pay the bills on time and I fix the plumbing problem, which might be completely disregarded. So the person might not even register or not pay attention to these experiences, which in a sense disconfirm this bottom line judgment or this core belief. Or there might also be this effort to transform these quote unquote positive kind of triangles here into these negative rectangles. So yes, I did get praise from my boss, but in fact, I didn't really deserve it. So I'm still incompetent. Even though I received praise from my boss, it doesn't count. So really kind of discounting this experiencing or this experience or modulating so that it is still consistent with this belief I'm incompetent. So the work in psychotherapy might be then to work on helping the client recognize these experiences here at the bottom, so these triangles of letting them in a sense modify these core belief, which is a work that's very difficult to do and which requires a lot of time as well. That often thought to be even months or even years of psychotherapy for that. And also modifying of seeing that process, how the client might pay attention to the process of going from I get praise from my boss and I recognize that is an experience that means that I'm competent, rather than changing it automatically to but I don't deserve it, or kind of discounting this evidence. So that's thought to be something quite standard in cognitive behavioral therapy, and how one might approach the work on the self. So as I said, the therapeutic action would be to deconstruct the maladaptive rules. So not just these core belief above, but maybe the rules which influence what is actually registered or not. So for example, these rules, if I accomplish X, I'm a winner. If not, I'm a loser. And of maybe changing these rules to, okay, if I accomplish this, this is great for me, but it doesn't, but if I don't, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a loser. I'm a person who's done other things as well, or whose self-worth is not entirely dependent on my accomplishments, for example. So as we can see, in terms of differences and similarities with the prior Buddhist view I presented, so there might be these similarities in terms of labels and suffering, of seeing how these labels, or when we talked about this attachment or this craving for certain labels, might create some suffering. There might also be similarities in terms of the focus in the Noble Eightfold Path on the right views. So this CBT perspective might be also consistent with the Noble Eightfold Path of having something a bit more balanced, even if it's just a skillful means, waiting for this more ultimate truth about this no self or not self. And then there might be also this importance of wholesome and unwholesome states of mind in Buddhism and in cognitive behavioral therapy. So of seeing, okay, where does it actually lead me? Where I'm holding this belief, or in a sense clinging to this belief about my self-worth. Does that lead to wholesome or unwholesome actions? And also in terms of dealing with the five hindrances, which I won't have time to delve a bit more into it, but there might be some similarities in terms of Buddhism and CBT in the approach to working with thoughts. But there might be also some important difference in terms of the fact that the CBT model is very still embedded in this evaluative framework of the self. So of maybe in a sense transforming these negative appreciations into a bit more realistic or a bit more balanced appreciations of the self. So which is still very much in this evaluative mindset in some sense, which might then feed into this suffering. So then moving to the acceptance commitment therapy. So in this acceptance and commitment therapy, there are these three senses of the self. So going back to the previous model of the self that I introduced with these different selves, there is this self as process, which is a bit more linked to, if we just go back to this, so to this self as experience, the first one here. So really looking at what's going on in this moment-to-moment experience with my thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations. And then there's this observer self, which is, so in ACT, it's really more thought to be this part of us that's able to observe our own experiences, which might be different from the experience, but more this ability of us to be conscious and to observe from this part of ourselves, or from this point of view, from this perspective of this observer self, which is not necessarily thought to be an actual separate part, but more this process or this ability to do this. But we use this concept of the observer self as a bit as a metaphor for that process. And then there's this sense of the conceptualized self. So this is a more in terms of our labels, or these to go back to the other model, to this more representational self, and maybe also this self as structure to some extent, of seeing what are these labels about myself, how do I view myself, do I see myself as a good person, as a bad person, as someone who's kind, caring, who's whether they might be quote unquote positive or negative. But it is taught in ACT that these self-concepts and these labels, although it's inevitable from our learning history that we develop them, that really getting fused, so really not being able to have a bit more of a detached view from these labels, or really letting our behavior be totally dominated by these labels, is thought to be the actual problem. So it's not so much these labels in terms of ACT that are problematic, but more how we relate to these labels about ourselves. So, for example, if I have the thought I'm unlovable, for example, and then because of that, I'm not going to parties because I believe that people won't appreciate me, then this becomes a bit more problematic from that point of view. But if I do hold this belief still, okay, I'm unlovable, but I'm able to see it and see it from a bit of a more removed perspective, to the point where it doesn't stop me from actually going to the party or enjoying myself, then this is not thought to be necessarily problematic from an ACT point of view. So in terms of the model of therapeutic action, so I'm drawing this, I have this image of the chessboard metaphor. So for those of you who are a bit more familiar with ACT, you might know this quite well, but it's more this idea of in our minds, we might have these different labels or different views of ourselves. So the white pieces and the black pieces. So the white pieces could be, for example, these quote unquote good labels about ourselves, and these black pieces might be these bad labels about ourselves. And they're taught to be in this battle. But the idea with ACT is to see, okay, how can we move on to, instead of being either the white pieces or identifying with the black pieces, how we might be able to experience ourselves as the board, the chessboard. So as the holder, the receptacle of the container of all of these different experiences, without necessarily identifying with any specific part, that they're all part of our experiences, the board, the white pieces, and the black pieces. So the model of therapeutic action is that in ACT, we might help clients have learn to have a bit more distance between the self as process, so or this observer self, so this ability to look at one's experience and these labels, so to create a bit of this space so that people might be able to still hold these labels, but not let them, not let these labels define them or affect their behavior so much. There's also this focus on these mindfulness processes and valued actions, and a lot of focus on the function of these labels. So when I hold this label that I'm unlovable, to go back to my previous example, what follows from that, or what comes just before that, and analyze what purpose these labels serves, or what consequences these labels have on my actions when I get fused with these labels. So there might be a lot of similarities. So in terms of the mindfulness aspect of things, this process of attending to these mental constructions as one of the five aggregates, these multiple causes that go into a behavior, or in terms of constructing our senses of the self. There might be also this. Oh, I just noticed that I have 4 messages. I don't know if these were questions. Okay. Okay, I'll answer these questions afterwards. So there might be also some differences. So in terms of the observer self, so in terms of ACT, even though in parts of ACT it's seen more as a process, in other parts it's seen more as some part of us that's unchanging, that's fixed, or that's more neutral, which may or may not be totally consistent with some Buddhist views. And what might also say that there might still be this conceit of the I, or with linked to that observer self, or this conceptualized self in terms of the ACT, which might be a bit different from Buddhism. So kind of moving on to the clinical framework. So in terms of this part, so I base myself upon this philosophical framework from Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self work, where he talks a lot about narratives and how narratives are seen as an essential component of our lives that are taught to come from our ability to always interpret ourselves, or to always make sense of ourselves in the context we're actually living in, which is not meant to be seen as the fact that these narratives are something that are only created by us, but that are really co-constructed with other people, with our cultures, with others, so that we're taught to form these narratives, and that these narratives have also ethical dimensions. So they're not only something that we do, but they're just something that are good to do in a sense as well, because they provide us with a sense of the good, a sense of direction. So it might be quite minimal, so it doesn't have to be something grand. So it might be, for example, so I'm waking up this morning because I think that my job is something that I found valuable or important, and I work to serve people, which is something that has meaning or value to me. So this might be something, this narrative about myself that I'm co-constructing, that makes sense of what is good for me, what is important, why I'm actually waking up this morning, and not staying in bed, napping all day, for example. So in terms of this clinical framework that I tried to come up with to help organize a bit my thinking and also some clinical encounters and support people, support clients, is that there's these different perspectives. So this perspective of this reinterpreting, so still working with narratives, but working on how to reshape these narratives, and this perspective also of sidestepping. So really stepping somewhat outside of these narratives in order to help clients. And in this reinterpreting, I separated into two sections, so the reconstructing part and the expanding part. So I'm going to use a clinical example to which I'm going to come back with to help ground it into something more concrete. So Kate is a woman in her late 30s with 2 children. She struggles with low self-esteem and shame following a long-term unemployment in the context of a disability. So she copes with difficulty with the loss of her professional identity and the impact of her illness on her family. So afraid of not being a good parent or not being able to provide for her family. So she struggles a lot with thoughts and beliefs such as I'm useless right now that I don't have this job, or right now that I can't be the parent I want to be, and I'm a failure. And she wishes to work in psychotherapy on her self-esteem because she states that it causes her to avoid social contacts, which have been a very important part of her support. And she feels ashamed of herself, and she feels that others will judge her, which prevents her from actually reaching out and recruiting important supports. So within this framework, so I'm going to focus first on the reinterpreting perspective. So in terms of this reinterpreting, one might be the first step in clinical practice might be to work on actually building or co-constructing with the client this narrative, so making it more explicit. So perhaps for Kate, making sense of what it's like for her to actually go through this experience, really delving into it, the emotional impact, how things were for her before, how things are for her, how does she make sense of these changes. So actually building this first narrative or making it explicit. And then looking at some of these beliefs she has about herself. So as I mentioned before, I'm unlovable, or I'm useless right now. And then afterwards, the part of the clinical work might be then to move on to reconstructing a different narrative that's perhaps a bit more balanced. So, okay, yes, I'm not able to have this job right now, but I'm still able to volunteer, or I'm still able to help out my mother who's sick right now, or I'm still able to work on hobbies or to play music, which is very important for me, for example. So it might be looking at a bit like what we were talking about with the CBT model of finding a different or perhaps a more balanced narrative, which might be one way of helping Kate actually navigate these challenges that she's going through right now. So working on explicitly on the belief that I'm a failure and I'm useless by working on these rules and assumptions and building this different narrative. So this might be one possibility in terms of clinical practice. And then the other possibility might be to work still within this narrative perspective, but focusing more on expanding. So in terms of this expanding, so we might still work, and also I think it's very important not to move on too quickly to the second part, but really to spend enough time with the first part and to really appreciate and make sense with the clients of this, of what they're going through and their struggles and their points of view on things, because I think that perhaps moving a bit too quickly might leave the person feeling not really understood or not really feeling validated. So in this the second model, it wouldn't be so much changing the first narrative. So as you can see, the narrative with the red letters is still there. So we're not really working or targeting that specifically, but what we're building is expanding this sense that she has of herself and expanding this narrative. So it might be not necessarily explicitly focusing on these beliefs, I'm a failure, I'm useless, but more working at, okay, what else is important for me? What else can I, what other elements do I bring to the table, or what else is important for me as a person, in order to help provide a richer sense of self, and adding complexity or layers to her understanding, or to her broad narrative of herself. It would be also to focus on other aspects of her life apart from this perceived failure. So perhaps focusing on her values, focusing on strengths, focusing on other aspects of herself. So this approach is quite commonly found in different types of psychotherapy. So for example, narrative therapy is an approach that uses a lot of these elements. So interpersonal psychotherapy also uses a lot of these elements, not really reworking on this so much on the previous narrative, but building on expanding. Psychodynamic therapy and ACT also to some extent might be focusing a lot on using that approach. So I'm not saying that all of these approaches are, for example, a CBT practitioner might be able to use all of these different approaches, psychodynamic therapists also all of these approaches, an ACT therapist all of these approaches as well. But some of these approaches are more typical in some models. So then in terms of the sidestepping, so sidestepping is not actually sidestepping from the concern of the clients, but really sidestepping from this framework of the narratives. And here comes for me the Buddhist influence, and what has really helped me a lot in seeing this as another possible therapeutic option, is that I was thinking that it seems that in this low self-esteem there seems to be we seem to be kind of caught almost in a vicious circle of, for example, like if we start at the top here, this person might have a low self-esteem, but then this creates this desire for perhaps a better self-esteem or a better sense of self-worth, but also this aversion for how one is in this moment. So where we can see a lot of self-criticism, of self-hate, for example, of shame. And then this continues the struggle, the dissatisfaction, as there's this gap between how one perceives him or herself or themselves, and how they might wish to be perceived or to perceive themselves. So then this would feed into this wish to change the self-view, but then this would keep one stuck in this framework of self, or perhaps from using Buddhist elements from this delusion, or using this language of the three defilements, which would then feed into the self-esteem by keeping us stuck in this evaluative framework about oneself and one's self-worth. So here, for me, kind of this importance of seeing this other option where one might sidestep this narrative discourse about judgment or about ways of viewing oneself. So then this is where these three defilements are included: this delusion, as I talked about, but also this desire and aversion here. Realizing nevertheless that it might be in a very different context, that in terms of the Buddhist influences link more to this end goal of enlightenment, or for oneself and for other people, whereas in psychotherapy the end goal or the ethical context might be quite different too. So in terms of this sidestep, so this is an image actually taken from ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, is that we're taught to be in this struggle with for example here, this monster of self-doubt, unworthiness, fear, sadness, anxiety. But that actually what might be more helpful is to just drop completely the struggle. So to drop the rope, or stop fighting for a certain self-esteem or against a certain self-esteem, for example, and simply sidestepping it. So this might be the goal in therapy might be to help us, like I was talking before with ACT, to move from a more, perhaps a bit more of a detached, or from a more remote perspective, where one might observe these self-concept, not necessarily work on changing them or whatsoever, but just allowing them to be there, but focusing on what matters to us, on our values, on our on what is meaningful for us, and maybe stepping outside of this framework of the self. And other ways might be to work more on this acceptance or simply allowance of what is, and also on these different branches of psychotherapy now, which are focusing more on self-compassion rather than self-esteem. So moving more to self-compassion, self-acceptance rather than self-esteem. So then for Jane, for example, this might be help her get aware of these beliefs that she has about herself and these expectations or these assumptions and the consequences of these beliefs, and maybe move to a point where she's aware that, okay, these are stories about myself, or these are stories about, you know, I am kind of not good enough, but seeing how these might be stories that come up in her mind, but that she doesn't necessarily need to fuse necessarily with. So just to kind of wrap it up, so I see these three different approaches as very complementary, so not mutually exclusive at all. So one might be able to combine them in psychotherapy independently of the branch of psychotherapy. They might all have their uses, and that is quite context dependent. So for example, if someone, for example, we've been working on core beliefs for a while and it simply doesn't seem to work very well, then one might work a bit more with a sidestepping approach for a few sessions, see if that's helpful in any ways, or a bit more of this expanding approach rather than sticking with one approach, or giving us different ways, or perhaps to use Buddhist terminology, more skillful means of arriving at decreasing these struggles or this suffering linked to the self. So to conclude, so I did present these different various models of the self from these different points of view, with keeping in mind this very pragmatic approach that is still centered on this natural tendency to interpret ourselves using these narratives, and introduce this clinical framework with this reinterpreting, deconstructing, this reinterpreting, expanding, and this sidestepping approach. So now I'm gonna stop for now, and what I'll do is I'll open it up for questions. I'm just trying to find the chat.
It's at the bottom of your screen, Nicolas. There's a chat bubble, and if you don't see, if it doesn't say chat at the bottom, there's 3 dots that say more. If you click on that, you'll find your chat there.
I got it. Thanks. Yeah.
Did you want me to? Do you still want your slide up, or did you want to stop sharing and then
I can stop the share.
There we go. Now you're full screen. So anybody that has questions can either type them in the chat, or they can come on through audio and video and ask your questions. And thank you, Nicolas.
Hi, Nicolas.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, this is Joyce. Yeah, Sasa, I have a quick question about the step siding. Is this what you start? I'm really interested about that. Could you say more about the concept about this thing?
Yeah, can you tell me a bit about? Tell me what you're anxious about in terms of that approach, or what you understand or from that approach.
Yes, certainly. Because I'm really interested about like how do you apply the Buddhism? How do you bring it as like the step into the psychotherapies? Like how do you bring up like in the normal psychotherapies, we are really scientific and really like yeah, it's pretty like educational and scientific, right? But if you want like to integrate the spirituality into the therapy, it would be the totally difference. So can you share with us like your experience maybe example, how do you bring in your spirituality into the psychotherapies?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very kind of complex and interesting question. So in terms of I think the context is very important. At TCAP, for example, the Toronto Center for Applied Buddhism, there's a bit more of a space to introduce these Buddhist concepts and talk about these views of the self and introduce more spirituality in a direct way. But in a more secular context, one might perhaps either see if the client is open or wants to discuss it, or else in terms of the sidestepping approach, I don't think it's necessarily also a model that's not already found in some Western psychotherapy traditions. So for example, the ACT, the self-compassion, kind of self-compassion based therapy and compassion-focused therapy, for example, already use a lot of these sidestepping approaches too. So I do think that already in the Western psychology model, there is some sidestepping too. But that obviously the Buddhist influences or the discussing more the spiritual aspect directly with the client who might be open to that, or depending on the context, could also be quite helpful.
Do you have any example? Can you introduce any example about those? Oh, sorry, Jason. Go ahead. You have a question.
You can complete your question. Sorry.
No, I finished. I just want to ask for any experience example. Yeah, please.
Yeah, in terms of examples, there might be, for example, I did have one client where I was doing more ACT, and with her, she was also a client who was Buddhist. So in terms of her, we talked about more different Buddhist models of the self, and looking at her experiences and looking also at the self, and these metaphors of the chessboard or the chariot, for example, are things that we discussed. And we also moved to seeing how she's able to see these stories that her mind naturally creates, and how she's able to see them as stories and kind of label them as stories, and see what direction she might take afterwards. So does she want to kind of follow what the stories tell her, what they tell her to do, or does she actually want to do something a bit different? So going from a point where she can be mindful and aware that this is going on, or a bit from a more kind of metacognitive point of view where she's able to observe what's going on inside of her and have more agency or choice about what she would like to do afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Nicolas, I'm just curious, and maybe this was in the talk, but I just missed it, but in your kind of orientation in Taylor's narrativity, did you then kind of circle back to look at precisely, or not precisely, but how you would relate that to the 5 skandhas, the 3 marks, the 3, sort of the basic kind of template of kind of Buddhist elements of the self that you talked about at the beginning? Because I kind of I wonder, because I see the narrative piece, but I don't necessarily see how that relates to some of those earlier some of those fundamental Buddhist concepts that you started off talking about. So I wondered if you explicitly have brought them into conversation.
Perhaps a bit more, less with the skandhas. So I haven't really thought about that part specifically, or about, I think it could be interesting in terms of, there might be some understandings of how what might kind of introduce, like, or like use these different skandhas as elements for the narratives, as well. So seeing like, okay, am I my body or not, or what about my appearance or my thoughts or my emotions? So I could see them as being kind of integrated in these narratives. But I focus a bit more on the 3 defilements or the 3 marks at the end when talking about this cycle of the self, and how that contributes to perhaps a bit more of the suffering, and how even just noticing that in psychotherapy, of noticing, okay, do I have this this craving or these aversions for these parts of oneself or not, or this belief in okay, this is something true about me, and that means that I can be these different things, might also be something that can be reflected on in psychotherapy.
And I'm just curious too, like if sort of what the sort of spiritual dimension, or I guess it's philosophical as well, that kind of maybe Joyce was kind of hinting at, could be in the relative and ultimate levels. Like if the three kind of, if the three elements that we're kind of always getting tripped up on around, you know, greed, hatred, and delusion are part of the story on the relative level. If working with clients, if there's space for working with clients around differentiating between a relative and an absolute level, if that has like a therapeutic usefulness, like it more frames it as a very specifically Buddhist question, right? Which we kind of talked about a little bit at TCAP, but I'm just kind of curious if you thought about that.
No, I hadn't thought about separating that, like talking explicitly about that more conventional and that ultimate truth, but I do see how it could be potentially useful as well. I think there's always this like as we discuss also at TCAP often, like this risk of, okay, would it be spiritual bypassing or not? And this is the reason why I'm thinking that it might be important to spend a lot of time on the first part of the narrative, and maybe not going too quickly to the second part of really kind of giving enough time and attention and depth and kind of emotional resonance to the first part as well.
So sort of saying that the idea of kind of an ultimate, or kind of a, you know, could be kind of an expanded narrative in a way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it could be seen as either the sidestepping or the expanding, right? Yeah.
I put in chat about, do you talk about self-esteem? And how would you think, from the Buddhist perspective, self-esteem is looked at or described or evaluated?
Yeah, that's always tricky in terms of kind of doing a bit of that translation work, because there might not be exactly that corresponding element in some Buddhist traditions, for example, or I might not be aware of these specific talks about self-esteem, but it might be more about how I understand it is more this kind of craving for certain perhaps mental states or mental formations about oneself, and maybe these aversions to these other mental formations perhaps. So, and how that might be linked also to this attachment or this clinging to certain images of the self or certain aspired images of the self.
So it's like a self-construct of certain positive aspects of oneself that is worthy of esteem. And from a psychotherapy perspective, is this a good goal? Like people come in and ask you, I want to have better self-esteem. How would you address that? And if you want to apply Buddhism concept, like how would you try to deconstruct that with the client, or would you kind of go with, you know, like constructing the self-esteem with the client?
I'm not sure. I'm going to answer the question, but I'm not sure. Tell me if I understood it correctly. But it seems that I think if a client comes up, and which happens very frequently, I think I've kind of done an informal kind of survey of the clients I've seen in the past, maybe almost past year, and almost I think 2/3 wanted to work on self-esteem as part of their initial concern. So I think it's very, very frequent. So the first question for me would be like, okay, what do you mean exactly by self-esteem, or what would be different? And getting it to understand, like, okay, what happens when they feel that they have low self-esteem? What are the consequences? You know, what happens in terms of their life? What might they be avoiding, for example, or seeing more concretely at what they mean by self-esteem. So clarifying it would be my first step, and then afterwards we could go from these different routes or different perspectives in terms of the sidestepping or the reinterpreting, kind of either this expanding or this reconstructing. Did I answer your question, Chris, or did you have something more kind of precise in mind?
Yeah, it's like you said, it seems popular. People in the West especially want to come in, they want to have more self-esteem, and it seems to come from a place where they don't feel they have self-esteem. There's certain devaluation of their self, or de-esteem. And so I'm just wondering how it parallel or not with the Buddhist perspective on the self.
And what do you mean by parallel?
Yeah, like how Buddhism sees self-esteem in terms of a Buddhist path, or a goal of Buddhist practice, and how then, if you use Buddhist ideas and concept in psychotherapy, when people come in with self-esteem and wanting to have this esteemed kind of self, and is it incompatible with a Buddhist way of thinking about the self?
Yeah, this is where this was really kind of the bulk of my talk, and especially at the elements of the bulk of the reflection, especially around this cycle of self-esteem. So maybe I can go back to this image if you want of this cycle. Just a second. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah, so
yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, really going back to that aspect, this is where I saw the Buddhist influence, possibly kind of one way that it could come in into like recognizing that this cycle might be going on in this moment, and that it might or might not be useful to work directly on self-esteem. So, but I think a flexible approach is often required, because the first step might be to really go into see what's going on right now with what does the person mean by self-esteem, what are these narratives that they're coming up with, but also keeping that in mind, how, okay, is this person really caught in this kind of evaluative framework about the self, and where this Buddhist influence might see that, okay, perhaps there's a risk of getting stuck in that cycle, and seeing how would it be more skillful to actually work directly on this and maybe go with a bit of a more sidestepping approach, or really sidestepping from this actual framework, or do I want to stay with this more evaluative framework of the self, but go a bit more into this expanding of building this richer sense of self, or modifying a bit this perspective of the self. I don't know if that's a bit clearer.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm aware of the time, and like to help wrap up this presentation of Nicolas. But I want to add that, well, in relation to the questions of Joyce, Jason, and Chris, I think that perhaps the teachings of dependent origination can also be integrated into psychotherapy. I remember that in one of your slides, you mentioned that the development of the concept of self began at the link of becoming. I kind of understand why you have that kind of conception, but the traditional Buddhist understanding is that this self already began at the first link of ignorance. And indeed, ignorance is understood or defined in Buddhism as the lack of awareness, or the misbelief of having this illusory self. Okay, so perhaps what you were indicating about becoming and this generation of a false sense of self is more or less like the self in progress. Okay? And that if you review these 12 links of dependent origination, it provides us a model to examine this inner struggle, and also, the poisons that you mentioned in sidestepping, how we come up with a sense of self that is leading us into a state of suffering and pain, and how by becoming aware of this, we could find a way out of this pit that we are in. Perhaps this is something that we could integrate into psychotherapy as well. Would that be something that goes along with your understanding, Nicolas?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I do think that this would be very pertinent, and a bit like I think perhaps this was tied to kind of what Jason was talking about. If I got it correctly, of maybe seeing these two levels and seeing how this ignorance can feed into it, and how we might directly approach it, and perhaps having more of this right view in terms of the Eightfold Path might be something that could be worked on in terms of the therapy. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you very much for attending this presentation by Nicolas. Any last word, any last questions before we close this?
I just want to say one thing that I'm curious about, and is just that we didn't talk about. The word that didn't come up is fear. And for me, like the question of like emptiness invokes the idea of a kind of a nihilism, right? Like an avoiding of the self. And so I think self-esteem can also be seen as a way to shore up something that's real against that claim of emptiness. So that's another piece that I'm curious about that I just wanted to put in there at the very end.
Yeah, well, the challenging thing, I think, is that there are different definitions of self and also different definitions and understanding of emptiness. So how to navigate around all these maybe, it requires some therapeutic training and tricks, to help with the patients who have this kind of fear. Nicolas?
No, I agree. I think it's also something that a few authors have commented upon. I think Mark Epstein might have talked about that when he was talking more about this fear of breakdown, or fear of kind of falling, in terms of this emptiness, and how these constructions of the self can actually have kind of their function might be to actually protect against some of these fears. So that's definitely something that some authors have mentioned about how perhaps in some ways kind of in a sense it might be a way of coping. It might be adaptive to some point, so that one might be careful in a sense before kind of to use kind of more dynamic terms, kind of attacking the defenses, or attacking parts that serve a useful protection. So I think it's a good point in seeing how we might be attuned to that, and maybe a bit more careful in terms of choosing our interventions or the context of our interventions. Yeah, it's a good.
I just had one point to add, that in terms of conventional and ultimate truth from a Yogacara traditional perspective. So when we work in psychotherapy, we deal with more the conventional truth level, but if we have the ultimate truth in mind, so the conventional truth is the field where we could drop into the ultimate truth at some point. And so then it speaks to the goal of psychotherapy, like whether it's just shoring up the self, or actually having a more understanding of the ultimate reality. So I think that may be like a Buddhist contribution or a Buddhist perspectives to psychotherapy, by going into this more Yogacara perspective, or the conventional and ultimate truth, that maybe.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, thank you.
I think from Nicolas' presentation, I'm hearing his willingness to adapt to different spiritual needs and psychological needs of his patients. That he expresses this kind of fluidity to switch, to shift between different models of psychotherapy. And with that in mind, perhaps with regard to Chris's question, maybe patients would also have different understandings and expectations of the ultimate truth. You know, they may come from a Christian background or a Buddhist background or a Muslim background, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so it's always good to keep in mind how the psychotherapy can help these patients to work towards that kind of spiritual goal. You know, so to work with their conventional self, so that they could be prepared, you know, to reach their own, you know, spiritual, in a sense of the ultimate truth. You know, that kind of direction.
I forgot to add also at the end, because I didn't go through the whole of the presentation, but if people have any kind of questions or requests or whatsoever, I also have my information here and kind of my acknowledgements as well of people who I thank for this kind of presentation. I have my email address at the bottom if anyone wants to contact me whatsoever. So yeah, just a final thanks to Henry Shiu and Kenneth Fung, to the TCAP community, and thank you to Chris and Jason as well for the many different discussions, and for the reading group, and to one of my friends also who reviewed this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we will close it here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone for coming.
Thanks, Nicolas.
Thank you.